Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Penn, one of the co-founders of Open Nurses, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Zach Skiles, PsyD, to the show tonight. He is a longtime friend, and he's a psychologist. He's also a primary therapist with the Social Neuroscience and Psychotherapy, or SNAP Lab, catchy title, at the Portland VA, supporting trials of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and methamphetamine use disorder, and also MDMA-assisted group therapy, psychotherapy for PTSD. He also acts as the resident psychologist for Heroic Hearts Project, supporting wellness retreats for veterans and spouses with ayahuasca and psilocybin. Zach also continues his work as a therapist for the Mission Within, serving U.S. Special Forces communities with a regiment of ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT. I have some questions about that. As an educator with UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics and the California Institute for Integral Studies, his focus aligns military and veteran culture with traditional medicine practice. So please welcome Zach onto the screen here. And as he gets settled in, it'd be great if people could put in the chat where they're watching from and what your background is, and we'll get to questions from the audience towards the end of our conversation. So Zach, welcome.
Thanks, bud. It's good to see you.
Thanks for being here. Yeah, it's good to see you too. I was hoping to be in a place with a more flattering camera, but my computer decided to misbehave, so we're doing this over my phone. It's been a bit of a scrambled day. I came and gave blood at the university today, and I'm claiming a little bit of anemia for my bumbleness, more so than usual.
You're going to take blood from you any way they can.
I know, right? Yeah, that's academic life for you, right? They're gonna take a pint out of you one way or the other. So hey, you've done a lot of things in your psychedelic career, and and not just psychedelics, but tell us a little bit about how'd you get started with this?
I think it came from just the mother of necessity, really. I invaded Iraq in 2013 and had significant experiences myself, as well as the friendships that I had built with others that pulled from combat exposure, and really just gave me a strong sense of motivation to understand my own psychology and enter into a field of healing. I developed kind of a knack, or maybe even had a knack just naturally, in psychology that some of my counselors would point out occasionally. And after kind of learning more and more, they were like, Zach, you should think about actually stepping into this field. And I did. I was also just really interested in consciousness and mindfulness and kind of many different philosophies that we have around the world after traveling to places like Iraq and Africa, seeing kind of community-based care and what it looked like after creating the first PTSD clinic for Sudanese People's Liberation Army and their family members. And realized that I did have a bit of a knack for it, and so got my doctorate in psychology because I wanted to be the best therapist I could be, specifically in kind of the world of PsyDs. And my concentration honestly was in trauma, and in doing so just delved further and further into mindful-based practices and uh, developed different kinds of groups and inpatient programs at the Northern California VA, and then was slowly introduced to these special forces communities. My specialty, specifically at the VA, was with combat exposure, and
Mhm.
there were a lot of folks down in Mexico at a place called the Mission Within, who had had a lot of blast injuries, were managing traumatic brain injury as well as post trauma and chronic pain. And this was all kind of in my wheelhouse after years of clinical practice or work, both as a peer counselor as well as in a student role as a therapist. And at that time, I didn't know a heck of a lot about psychedelics. I had had
Mhm.
some when I was stationed in Okinawa, Japan. I had some psilocybin and had like my own experiences with that and thought, okay, well, that was wild, and kind of moved right on and didn't have much of a framework for it. So I had that as a kind of guiding post of maybe there's something more to this, and studied a bit about it before I went down to start shadowing and then working with uh, our veterans in the mission within. So using ibogaine and 5-MeO as a regiment, and really helping folks in preparation as well as in the integration process too. It kind of was the more bang for your buck, really. Like psychedelics can do a lot, but like the other probably 50% of that is what we're doing in integration.
Mm, okay, I want to put a pin in that because that's different than what we sometimes hear from the media, right? You know,
Yeah.
one day is like 10 years of therapy, right? So, okay, I can't resist. You had your first psychedelic experience while in the Marines?
Yeah, I was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and I was 19 years old. Uh, it was a difficult unit to be a part of. The kind of hate and discontent that was encouraged in the ranks,
Mhm.
which does wonders for conditioning. So that my tour in Iraq for the invasion was probably aided by the difficulty of this unit. Um, Nevertheless, we had the highest suicide rate at the time in the armed
Mm.
forces, and having a friend from like Schenectady go out in Okinawa and come back with a handful of mushrooms and say, "Take these, try this out." I didn't really know what I was signing up for, um, and in doing so, it was something that was really therapeutic. At the time, I was actually experiencing a lot of symptoms of depression. Like my appetite was gone. I was in a really difficult place just in general, and then also emotionally. Um,
Mm.
and it didn't really hit me that psilocybin shifted that. My appetite came back. Like I started bonding more with the people around me, and
Mhm.
there's a kind of running joke in my circle of friends in the military that's also why I bounced back from Iraq so well, because we had psilocybin in Okinawa at our fingertips because it was legal at the time over there.
Really? Okay, interesting. Okay, so this wasn't, Marine Corps issued psilocybin.
Not yet, no, no.
Okay, and so you were 19. This was what year?
2001.
Oh.
So 9/11 had just happened. I had been actually I signed up pre 9/11, so um, I was probably 2 months in after the attacks in Okinawa, Japan. They had put us on the blacktop just in case we had to fly out anywhere after that. And then probably about a month or two later, I was ingesting psilocybin.
Wow, so that talk about a rite of passage. You're 19, you sign up in peacetime, suddenly it's wartime, you're on the other side of the world, and you're having your first psychedelic experience.
Yeah, it was wild.
That's
That's kind of been the sense for kind of how I've utilized psilocybin specifically too, because I think anybody who's had it or experienced it can speak to the kind of grounding mechanism that it offers, um, and to just kind of stay present with what's going on around you. And that was very much needed in that time. And I think something that I utilized for a lot of people during the invasion of Iraq, because the majority of my platoon actually didn't sign up in wartime. They signed up in peacetime. So we had a lot of circles after attacks or after convoys to really talk about like what people were experiencing or going through. Um,
Mhm.
I think there's a possibility or something to look into that. I don't know if I would be that primed for those kind of conversations had I not had some good grounding experiences before being shipped out.
Hmm. Well, that's an interesting, that raises a whole different interesting set of questions, doesn't it? Around like, what's the, we think about these things and a lot of your work has been around healing people with them, but this is a question around could you prepare people or even kind of inoculate them
Yeah,
eh,
that's
through these kind of experiences?
yeah. It's one of the cautions and also the I think larger conversation for folks, um, because we want to be careful of what we're actually shaping behaviorally with folks, and at the same time, um, we want to give people as much of a chance to be as present and conscious through really difficult experiences as possible. There's an old narrative I think of uh, the idea that everybody's going to put down their guns and there's not going to be a war ever again once everybody gets
Hmm.
dosed. Um, I just challenge that idea. Unfortunately, I would love to live
Hmm.
in a world where war wasn't necessary or a thing. There's a larger conversation, I think, too, to how we actually make that happen. That I think veterans should be at the forefront at, because many veterans who find themselves in combat experiences have often had to de-escalate into nonviolent means. But that takes presence. Like that takes somebody who's really present through some type of really high intense situation. And to me, that's the basis of why we also teach people mindfulness who are moving through combat experiences, because we want somebody who's able to make a decision when it's really, really needed, um, to be really aware of what's going on around them.
That's so interesting because, so often when you hear about combat trauma, you hear about dissociation. You hear about people losing chunks of memory from that time. And what I'm hearing from you is that there's also a sort of a hyper awareness of your circumstance in that moment. And, I would imagine that's adaptive. Like, you want a lot of my veterans that I work with talk about head on a swivel,
Yeah.
this just no, situational awareness and knowing what's happening around you at all times. And, when you're I would imagine in a, urban combat kind of situation or any combat situation, that would be adaptive. But you're talking about using that psychedelic experience as a means of cultivating presence in lots of different situations.
Hmm. Yeah. The idea that not only for your own presence, but also social bonds too. The kind of historic narrative that we've heard, for different tribes that would have ceremonial experiences before leaving to go off and fight, and also when they come back to move through medicine circles. So that would be for the kind of healing process, I think, to return to share your story, to remember, to become one again with the platoon. I
Mm,
think moving outward into that, um, there's definitely some caution to be had when we talk about shaping behavior and what it is that we want.
mhm,
And it's something that I think just still remains to be seen. Who this kind of
mhm,
falls in the hands of, how it's used, what's the approach going to be like. It's one of the reasons why I really appreciate really conservative organizations. The VA can be a headache and a half, but it's a conservative, slow moving, entity, because we don't want to make those kind of big decisions or big mistakes, really.
Hmm. Yeah. So what sort of potential mistakes do you think could be made? If we're looking, kind of looking out over the prow of the ship here, and what lies ahead? What are some of the potential difficult waters could that we could get ourselves into? I mean, I'm really interested in this idea that um, that these things can shape minds in multiple ways. It's not just it doesn't always engender sort of peace and love, right? That people are going to put down their weapons, that these can go in different directions. So I'd be curious to get your wisdom on what sort of potential risks there might be that we should be thinking about.
My mind always goes to that dystopian era type thing of like, well, you'll just shape this person to be more like this. But I think
Hmm.
um, where my mind also finds interest as well is in confidentiality and privacy, and specifically in group models where there's now reports of like telepathy and shared experiences that go beyond just communication. There's
Hmm.
stuff coming out of Harvard, it has been for a little while, that specifically notes that people have telepathic experiences with each other in groups. And what I try to suss out is that, is it actually telepathy, or are people just using the same medicine so they're having the same
Hmm.
chemical reaction or physiological experience to the point where they have the same ideas at the same time and are working in kind of similar manners? Or are they actually sharing consciousness? Have they both tapped
Hmm.
into some type of deeper communication, um, facilitated by medicine and psyche, that kind of overwhelming experience that allows the mind and body to tap into something greater?
Hmm.
To me,
Or,
um, what is the kind of signpost between the two are shared memories, details of things that
mhm.
really can't be explained by just having similar experiences. Um, and to me, that's a clear break in confidentiality and like what people can consent to when sharing
Mm.
their experiences, when they're ready to actually process things, that maybe, an inner protector, if we're working from the IFS model, isn't ready to share and isn't ready to really unfold just yet. And so for me, what I worry about is actually like further traumatizing a person and their abilities to kind of regulate and just connect with each other.
Yeah, there's a there's a fascinating I don't know if you ever listened to a podcast called The Emerald.
No.
There's Oh, you would love it. I'll send it. We'll put the link in the notes for this, but um this idea, he's talking about this idea of like the thought speech barrier, right? If we ever, right now, you can decide what you want to disclose from inside your mind, right? But if that, if I don't know, the Neuralink, thing ever works out that Musk is playing with, that somehow your thoughts could be detected outside of your own mind. That's a whole different frontier, right? Um, and thinking also about like, I think a lot of people who came to psychedelics from the sort of the more counterculture, depending on your vintage, whether that's Burning Man or the Summer of Love or whatever, that there's this patina of sort of peace and love around them. But if you're familiar with your history on this, at the same time that Leary was interested in opening people's minds, um, the CIA was interested in using this as a truth serum, and using this as a way of incapacitating large groups of people, and so these things are really pluripotent, right? You can use the same molecule for lots of different things. Some might be considered good, some might be considered not so good. Um, I mean, it's been interesting watching this curious bedfellows of like, when as you were at the MAPS conference as
Yeah.
well, seeing Rick Perry followed by Rick, oh, not Rick, Rick Doblin followed by Rick Perry, and it's pretty typical that if a Republican legislator is interested in this, it's usually because of the veteran angle, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's been the entry to that. But it's brought together groups of people that wouldn't normally otherwise be hanging out.
Yeah, it's been something that's been uh, kind of delicately managed, I think, a lot of the times. Um, and something that I think is a source of pride too, to be taken in by like veteran communities, that you get to be of service really to
Hmm.
continue kind of helping not only your community but the rest of the country out to receive care in ways
Hmm.
that are best practices, most state of the art. Um,
Yeah.
I I think there's a caution there too at times to not be a show pony and to make sure that we're being utilized appropriately. And even to use
Mm.
the word utilize, like I I caution people at times to make sure that they're using inclusivity to the best of their ability without just saying, here's a veteran, here's how traumatized they are. Um, okay, bye. Now let's talk about psychedelics. Um,
Mm.
there's something to uh, there's something to supporting different communities that are actually going to be sustaining and impactful, that don't actually continue a narrative, one of them being the broken veteran narrative, uh,
Hmm.
and and allowing there to still be some ownership in someone's uh, healed journey after recovery is over, and whatever that looks like for somebody, but to continue to move forward in a way that actually assimilates into the community so that they're not just being utilized for something, but they're a part of us.
Yeah. Do you see places where the veterans that you work with or that you know through this space are able to bring that out of the veteran circle? Because as a non as somebody who's always been a civilian, I see the veteran community sometimes and I think like, wow, that looks like a really amazing place, but I don't feel like I would ever fit in there. Even being like a clinician at the VA, I try and be really transparent with my patients that like I've never been in the service, because I don't want to lead people on. But I'm wondering like, as part of that sort of homecoming, like how do people that have healed in these veteran circles take that and bring that into a wider circle beyond the
Yeah.
veteran community? Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's actually some of the first people who introduced me into the psychedelic underground were veterans who were actually bringing it out into civilian cultures and having mixed groups. Um, that was really meaningful. And again, I think that's where the healing's at. And that's kind of the purpose, even outside of the psychedelic space. That's just what therapy is about. That's what reintegration is about, is getting veterans
Mm,
back into their communities, um, to be able to respect and experience in the identity therein, but really to come home and to live a
mm,
normal life. This is the goal, I think, in all ways. And so if psychedelics is a vehicle for that, which I've seen it be a really amazing one for, I think we have even more hope that um, veterans have the ability right now to make some big policy changes and start to facilitate, like we're talking about here in Washington, pushing policy that actually allows veteran organizations to be the ones utilizing psilocybin to then turn around and help not only veterans, but mental health providers and nurses, um, so that we're broadening communities and not just keeping it within the veteran community.
mm. And
We'll
really
see how that works
leveraging,
out. That's kind of we're still pushing that policy forward.
yeah, and really leveraging that knowledge base that exists in that community.
Yeah, that's that's been one of the the aspects I think that folks can easily be unaware of is actual like veteran peer support or veterans as facilitators, because you have an experience therein of kind of traditional healing practices that align with traditional occupations. The military being one of the oldest jobs in the world, and I've continually watched different yeah, different veterans get involved with civilian circles, but pulling from their military history of being really collectivistic, of really holding to the talking stick, or
Mhm.
being able to utilize like a structured communication and having kind of a hierarchy that allows elders to be the guides and leaders in our circles. Um, as well as there's this also reverence for the transitions that can happen in psychedelic medicine circles and psychedelic therapies, where I think you really get it from these rites of passage that so many veterans will go through when
Mhm.
starting off as a civilian and becoming, whether it's a marine or a sailor, soldier, or airman. um, there is a different identity that forms,
Yeah.
and your past identity has been kind of, yeah, for lack of a better word, it's just dead.
Mhm.
There's a sense of mortality there as well, an ending, and so holding people through that experience, that the person who you are that you started off with is no longer than the person you are now. It's continually informed veteran facilitators, to help people move through really transformational experiences.
Mhm. I mean, you're really describing the classic heroic journey, right? The hero's journey of that you cross the threshold, you sign up, you go to Paris Island or 29 Palms or San Diego, wherever you go, and you go through these trials and tribulations, you find helpers along the way, you face demons, and you come out a different person.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, it seems like that a lot of people talk about their important psychedelic experiences that way, that I mean, do some kind of some expectation management here that I think if people expect every psychedelic experience to be that, they'll probably be disappointed.
Yeah.
um, Jules Evans just did an interesting piece on the phenomenology of the meh experience, like not a bad trip, not an amazing trip, just sort of like it was okay, and that's more common than maybe people might own up to. um, but the really personally important ones often have that experience of sort of disintegration and reformation,
Yeah.
and it sounds like the military, in at least the initiation that you go through, is one of sort of identity dissolving and then reforming as somebody
Yeah.
else. But then there's no reverse boot camp, is there?
No. And I was actually just sitting here thinking about expanded states of consciousness as well, like in military experiences. And
Hmm.
anybody who's done the crucible, where you do significant obstacle courses and like destroy your body and don't eat but one meal for 3 days, you're going to have some expanded states of consciousness, and understanding how to work with that over and over again. Or myself, what I share at times too, the first 2 weeks of the war in Iraq, I slept for 11 hours in 14 days. And so um, there were definitely times of like hallucinations and expanded states of consciousness that, when I came back and tried to explain people to, they were just like, yeah, no idea.
Hmm.
So you have a lot of experiences to pull from.
Yeah, I would imagine things get kind of weird if you sleep 11 hours over 14 days.
So I totally stepped over your question, by the way. What was that?
No, I was thinking about, we do, so there's this really, I keep coming back to this thing that you sort of brought up earlier about um, a heroic journey and sort of dissolving who in an initiation, traditionally, as I think of them, you become part of something bigger than yourself,
Mm,
right? You're brought into a larger body, whether that's, as an adult in your tribe or whatever, or as a service member in your military. But there's a process in which you are kind of shepherded into that new role by people who've come before you, and that one of the critiques of like contemporary Western culture is we don't have that anymore. We don't, the military is one of the last places where that still actually kind of resides. And that, I know, like, Aldous Huxley talked about this in Island, about how, this culture that he had had created used, moksha, whatever that was, as a means of initiating young people into adulthood. And
yeah.
and but the thing I was thinking about is that, like, the military does a great job of kind of indoctrinating people into that role. But I wonder if you could talk about what's the reverse process when you come out of that role and back into civilian life.
Yeah.
There's no reverse boot camp, right? There's nothing that I mean, I know there is some when you just detach from the military. There's a little bit of a process, but it feels more kind of like it's sort of pro forma rather than like a real ritual. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, boot camp feels like, not having been through it, I can only imagine, but it seems like kind of a ritual of sorts.
Yeah. Absolutely. There is none. I was just sitting here thinking, gosh, I wish I could create that, and I kind of am in certain ways. Um, but I say that because there's a really great book called On Killing by Dave
On
Grossman.
killing.
Yeah,
Okay.
lieutenant colonel, I believe might be a colonel now. Um, he was teaching psychology at West Point, and I discovered his book on military psychology and specifically how we enable combatants to kill, because we have this innate resistance to not kill
Hmm.
each other and to protect the
Hmm.
tribe. There's like this innate wisdom that we have that which hurts another person actually hurts us in the end. Um, and so to desensitize from that innate knowing, we've had to hit a few different categories of ourselves to distance ourselves from the other to be able to pull the trigger. Um, and one of those ways was, so we have sort of general psychological distress. So the uh, kind of we kind of just give me 1 second. There, yes, there we go. They just had to connect in my head for a second. So you have general emotional, psychological distress, psychosocial distress, and then the kind of cultural, psychocultural, as well as mechanical distance. So
Hmm.
um, there's aspects of this that really start to break down someone's humanity when it comes
Hmm.
to your basic understanding of who the other is.
Hmm.
Um, so if they look different than you, if they speak a different language, that's a distancing.
Okay.
If there's something emotionally that's going on, or like some moral injury that's happened, somebody's philosophy is different than yours, that's a distance to then play with.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and then moving into cultural, so like being enlisted compared to being in an officer's position. Officers are considered high value targets, but enlisted men and women are just kind of thrown into the cannon fodder. Um, so again, not really having a humanization for some different types of folks.
Hmm.
And then the mechanical distance that we've seen in technology. So drones, as our tanks get better, being able to operate from further away from somebody is a physical distance that allows us to pull the trigger. And so
Hmm.
for me, those are what we are trained in combatants in boot camp. And those are also the targets I think we could be using when moving back into like a boot camp into recovery, to start to kind of resensitize ourselves to the other and to something that is maybe seen as a different philosophy still can be true. You can have a dialectical conversation around that fact and really lean into another person's values or culture. Yeah, and then seeing like how close in proximity we're able to get to each other, what intimacy actually can feel and look like in different ways. That to me sounds like and has been kind of a focus of a best route forward when thinking about that.
Wow. Do you think that would be challenging to tolerate if you were? I guess what I'm thinking here is that, like, you're in a combat zone and you're doing all these things that you're describing, that distancing, in order to be able to tolerate the things that you have to do in that to stay alive. Um,
Yeah, that's
and
that's the aspect of actually helping someone through knowing how to balance if somebody is actually still in active duty or if they're a civilian and there's a need to kind of still perform in different ways. Again, um, it's something that kind of harkens back to what we were talking about earlier, the presence that's needed. And I think the confounding variables that we often find in so many of our conflicts are actually something we need to look at. So like the actual legality of wars and what it is that we're actually involved in part of the time has a direct effect on moral injury and
Mhm.
PTSD and what it is that we're doing there and the justification for it. Um, it's a big policy issue and one that uh, oftentimes veterans get thrown into, even though they're like from Nebraska and they were 18 and they really didn't have anything to do with like the larger conversation. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's something that is incredibly difficult to take on, and it takes a really skilled clinician to know what wall to kind of look over and see if they're
Mhm.
ready to pull down anything just yet.
For people in the audience that are less familiar with the idea of moral injury, could you give us a little tutorial on what that is, and how, once you've done that, how psychedelics may interface with that idea of moral injury when somebody's healing with the help of psychedelics? Is moral injury potentially impacted by that? Could you talk
Yeah.
about that?
So moral injury in a simplified version um, is when you act against your own values, when you perform
Mm,
something that isn't in line with your own morality.
mhm,
You've morally injured yourself. You can do this in combat, as I was speaking to, like that which hurts another ultimately hurts you. You are
mhm,
actually acting against this innate moral that we all have. Um, and then there's kind of underlining conversations, even to what I just said, of what is justifiably needed. Um,
mhm,
is there's also similarities in substance abuse communities when somebody is continuing to use, even though it's not within their own values or aligned with what they want to do. They're really struggling not to continue, uh, yeah, the behavior. So there's just multiple ways. I say that there are multiple ways in which it plays out for folks, moral injury. And when it comes to psychedelics, it's in a really unique place for radical acceptance and self compassion and starting to have different perspectives around really entrenched morals, values, and behaviors. Um, Anything that's entrenched, psychedelics can have an impact on, but
mm,
specifically in our communities in the United States, something that I tell folks is that we come from a world of options, of opulence. We have Coke and Pepsi as our colas. We have Seven Up and Sprite. We have blue jeans and black jeans and skinny jeans and torn jeans or really nice jeans. We have anything that you could want the same thing of. Um, and so it's really hard for people to comprehend an experience where there's no good options and you just get what you get. And you have to live with that aspect. And if it turns out that that is outside of your moral compass, your spectrum of morality, uh, it's hard to return to your community and yourself at times to find some self-compassion and understanding of what it is that you've just experienced. Um, and so having the ability to step into a psychedelic experience that gives you self-compassion, that allows you the presence and the perspective to step back from it and really take into account what's happened to you and what's happening around the world and kind of the backdrop of time and culture and space that you were just born into, uh, really helps a person ground into an entrenched belief or really difficult experience that they're contending with.
So, so I hear that around self-compassion, that in order to heal from moral injury, I tell me if I've got this wrong, but it sounds like ultimately one has to forgive oneself.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's, there's there are experiences even that I've helped veterans through where they have all their friends come back and uh, even some of the combatants um, who come back just to sit with them in ceremony. These kind of spirits that
Mm,
they would call to come back and sit to tell them, remind them that self-compassion is needed and that they have it from them. They have compassion from
mhm,
these entities and that they're ready for them to let go as well, for them to hold some compassion for
mm,
themselves. And it can
mhm,
take a choir of people to really sit with folks who are officers, who are leaders, who really hold themselves to high esteem. But it's been my perspective, at least, that self-compassion is the defining feature to be able to just sit with, contend, and manage moral injury.
mm. And from your experience with working with veterans in this capacity, what would you say the aspects are that help to facilitate that? You know, if you were training a facilitator who's working with veterans who have this kind of moral injury and this kind of trauma, what would you tell them? What's going to help? I mean, obviously, it's going to be different from person to person, but in general, what would facilitate that person who's considering engaging with their moral injury in a psychedelic space?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I I think mirroring is always really important whenever you're in relationship with someone. So really being kind to yourself uh, and just kind of communicating and transparency of what that experience looks like for you, um, and ways in which we can all fall short, and the ways in which we can kind of help ourselves out. Um, and then moving into different approaches for different experiences. So there's something I call the shadow warrior
Hmm.
that gives somebody a model of clarity in which a warrior is able to discern, be present, and really operate in fullness.
Hmm.
Um, and then the kind of shadow aspects after being in war for a long period of time, getting tired of it, really
Hmm.
feeling victimized, going through the motions over and over again. So a messenger of self-compassion really takes the form of inspiration or creativity in that sense of like what is it that we can do here? But first, really starting off with just validation and acknowledgement of the fact that they can be a cog in the wheel at times. Again,
Mm,
you can start to see a theme about veterans being show ponies or used, um, because there have been really critical incidences in their lives where they were. And being compassionate with that experience and really calling it out for what it is going to be really important in that. The other aspect is um, liking the ability to kill or having an arousal for it.
mhm,
Um, for a lot of folks, it's really difficult to communicate the physiology of uh, elation that can happen when you don't die. And
mhm,
uh, that response can be really confusing for someone when they've just significantly hurt or killed someone else because of it.
mm,
Sitting with that as well has been one of the bigger challenges. And so, one of the inroads that I've recommended for a lot of folks is the challenger, not so much a challenger of this is bad, you should really think about this, but a challenger of how they're treating themselves. Um, as above is so below. And so when somebody is out into the world perpetrating violence or hurting others, a lot of the times they're hurting themselves.
mhm,
And really taking note of that aspect in relationship to another person and just checking in because it's our job to challenge anything that hurts them. And that kind of compassion can start to show that maybe they're worth it. Maybe they can be a little bit self-compassionate with themselves.
mhm. So what I'm really hearing is it's not so much about any particular thing you say or any technique that you exercise here. It's really much more about how you are in relation to the other person
Yeah.
is where a lot of the sort of the healing resides. That by you, the way oh, it's one of those ineffable psychedelic things, Zach. I'm trying to put words to it, and it's like blah blah. Um,
How I've seen
but
it too is there's that connection. So what I'm hearing from you as well as you connect those dots is the connection with the other that is
mm,
facilitated often by the bonding agents of psychedelics. So being able to find safety in a relationship to allow the nervous system to even sit with these experiences is a number one. And then sifting
mm,
through them in a way that normalizes and validates just in relationship, honestly, is has been kind of the key aspect for me.
mhm, mhm. And these groups of veterans that meet, I mean, I can totally understand why that makes sense, especially, the special forces groups, because that's such a rarefied bunch within the military. Um, do you see that as actually kind of creating barriers to coming back into civilian life? If you go through this big intense psychedelic experience with people that have had a similar military experience, does that create any barriers to kind of integrating back into your non-military life?
That's a good question too. I what I've seen so far is that what really has been creating a lot of the barriers is our stigma around psychedelic use. Um,
Mm,
because I've held people through their experiences that have been wildly transformative, and then watched them as they realize they have to go back to North Dakota and they can't actually tell anyone about the experience that
mhm,
they've had because in many people's minds they're just doing drugs, like they're not really
mhm,
doing anything but something illegal. And so there's that aspect of not being able to like fully return to a community and that
yeah,
same transparency, um,
right,
to be able to share themselves.
mhm,
But more often than not, it's really rare that there's a barrier after
Mm-hmm.
psychedelics to be able to connect back to communities. It's really common for folks to be able to connect with their families, to be able to just be more present where they're needed out in
Mm-hmm.
the world. If anything, we have to like tamper it down to be like, okay, this is transcendence, and we're going to concentrate on self competency and what we're actually good at so far, and we're not going to be evangelical about what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm struck by your use of the word remembering, and just really thinking about that in terms of coming back to some original state, as opposed to dismembering, right? To
Yeah.
cut apart, like this is really about reconnecting to something you once were and maybe lost in the process. There's some great questions coming in the chat. Let me shoot some of these out to you. Um, Somebody's asking, have you seen a pattern of vets having to give themselves permission to feel okay again? Is there kind of a self? I'm editorializing here, but is there an aspect where people feel that they're not allowed to feel okay?
Yeah, definitely. It's huge and a part of uh, several different veterans' experiences to the point where it's really important to bring it up in preparation sessions, um, especially if you're working in group experiences. We actually just did that with our MDMA group
Hmm.
psychotherapy cohort here up in Portland, and it's something that you have to kind of encourage folks to share, is that it's okay to share a really positive experience. It's actually okay
Hmm.
to feel joy, um, because it's so foreign to folks, and there's such a
Hmm.
um, for a lot of people there is a great experience of guilt, or survivor's guilt is what we would refer to for a lot of folks, um, to be alive and to feel joy, to feel
Hmm.
forgiveness about things that they feel like they don't quite deserve. And I wish that the narrative was true, that we could have a one and done experience when it comes to
Hmm.
this practice, but it is consistently shown to be a step by step model,
Hmm.
that you can have these experiences in the sun of compassion, um,
Hmm.
and slowly slip back into old behaviors if you're not actually practicing them or integrating them into your life.
Yeah. There's a question here that kind of tags off of what you were saying about the work you're doing with the group work with MDMA in Portland. Um, are psychedelic ceremonial groups in the US for veterans and non-veterans underground or out in the open? This one sounds like it's out in the open because it's a clinical trial. Are veterans advocacy groups focused on clinical and therapeutic settings?
So I can speak to both actually, because I'm
Okay.
in a funny place in my life where I'm working with clinical trials that are out in the open, and
Hmm.
I'm also now working with psilocybin groups for psilocybin services that are out in the open. I'm very used to working in the underground where you're not supposed to mention anything that's going on at all, but thankfully things are progressing in a pretty good manner. Um, I was
And
actually just
you're in Oregon to be
yes,
clear with folks who may not know that. Yeah, you're
yes.
in Portland.
Um, I am, yeah, operating out of Oregon. So the legalization of psilocybin services is what I'm referring to.
Hmm.
And the first group, the first veterans group, for psilocybin was back in November, and I was helping them move through that experiences, doing prep and integration. Um, it was, yeah, something that's being classified as a service, because of the kind of overall process of OHA.
Hmm.
They didn't want to get too far down the road in therapy. I think it's a bigger conversation that's really valuable that folks can have as we get into policy and legislation, because A lot of facilitators who are actual clinicians and could help with their training and education can't actually operate as such as facilitators
Mhm.
in the state of Oregon. It's different when it comes to Colorado. So a lot of the times, while therapy is happening and some really big clinical gains are being made, it's just referred to as a service, and we're processing it on the back end um, in ways like coaching or stepping in with a therapist like myself. So that's above ground advocacy veteran groups like Heroic Hearts. Heroic Hearts is
Mhm.
actually what I'm talking about. Um,
Okay.
and the SNAP lab at the Portland VA would be an above ground clinical trial. So that would be the MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD.
And you guys are also doing a study of psilocybin for methamphetamine use disorder, right?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
that's been an individual basis, but I was able to treat the first gay male veteran in U.S. history with psilocybin not
Mm,
long ago, which was pretty cool, as well as the first female veteran with psilocybin just a couple months ago, which was awesome.
fantastic.
Mm.
Another question here is asking about what preparation work you do for building those kind of connections with vets prior to moving to medicine, is asking about if you do any sort of complementary work like somatic work or anything like that.
It's definitely offered. So preparation always comes in the form of, for us, at least for myself, of kind of co-creating, co-collaborating guidelines of safety and resource, as well as consent. So what feels safe? What kind of practices do
Mhm.
you actually want to engage with? Some people really have a hard time just with psychotherapy. So moving into
Mhm.
some kind of somatic work is just crazy talk. Other people like really get down with spirituality or transpersonalism, while other folks want to concentrate on straight clinical work, which I can respect either end
Mhm.
from. And so it's just important to have a really deep um, understanding of where this person is at. And a lot of the times, I obviously work relationally. We start off with our authentic connection and kind of who we are as
Mhm.
human beings as we introduce ourselves, and then just really check out like what it is we're doing here, how it is that we feel safe with one another, kind of in a gestaltian way when you're talking about the presence, the task, and the goals of treatment to then form the
Mhm.
intentions to move forward together.
Mm. Do you guys ever use, there's a question here about ever using ketamine in sort of psycholytic doses as a way of introducing people to a felt sense of safety? Is that something you have an experience with?
I don't have a ton of experiences using ketamine in order to move people into a greater space, but I have had experience of moving them out of the space with ketamine.
Mm.
So if they're having a really significant experience, one of the things with the mission within, if a person was having a hard time with opioids or certain drugs that weren't going to work out with ibogaine, we would utilize a regimen of high dose psilocybin and high dose MDMA together. And coming out of that experience for some people can be a lot. So ketamine was offered in order to kind of help them come through their experience towards the end.
Mhm.
Um, to continue to talk and process and kind of share what was going on for them has been pretty valuable. Um, Yeah, I think in general, what I've used in the past to help people, what I did just recently with Heroic Hearts on that first psilocybin group, I used some breath work actually, in
Mm.
holotropic breath work. I organized folks in a little circle and just had them do that diaphragmatic breathing until they started to one by one hallucinate or alter consciousness, and then slowly came out of that and kind of talked about the experience. There was one person who noted that they completely dissociated and blacked out.
Hmm.
And so we actually shared kind of what that could mean for them when it came to their inner protectors and how they've dealt with kind of challenging experiences in their past. This person went along to actually have an amazing experience with psilocybin and the 2-dose model that we had for them in store. But I wonder if they would have had the same experience had they not had some preparation beforehand, where they first disassociated, then went in and had a pretty big session that was full of anger, and then a second session that then was much more open and actually had a significant somatic experience that was allowing them to open up and be present. There was something that needed to be worked out little by little that I think ketamine or even non-psychedelic practices that alter our consciousness can be used for.
Mhm. So I'm really hearing a lot of consideration for kind of pacing and speed at which you go into these things, that you're taking your time
Yeah.
and you're not pushing people into things faster than they're ready.
Yeah, it's important. Everyone unfolds the way they need to, just like we compartmentalize the way we need to. And really walking with a person and meeting them where they're at has been kind of the fallback when
Mm,
thinking about honoring resistance in all forms. Kind of
yeah.
thinking about like the veteran community as well, having to move through things that maybe they didn't ask for, maybe they were just told to do. Um, I think it's really important to give folks like that their own autonomy so that they actually have full control in what's going on. It's one of the reasons why drop-in groups are so uh, funny, I think, at the VA. They don't always work everywhere, but there are definitely drop-in groups where if you give veterans the ability to say no, they will show up. Um, and
Yep.
so I think there's something more to that when really walking through an experience with someone because they can say no. It's something that actually I'm remembering now. Christopher and I, the director of the SNAP Lab, we were walking through an experience of facilitating together. And one of our participants was having a really difficult time opening up
Mhm.
the inner protectors that they had. Um, were really helping them dig in. And
Mhm.
so it came to dosing day, and they were like, "Can't do it. No, won't do it." And so we were just like, "Okay, that's okay. You don't need to do it. It's fine." And I guess they thought like we were gonna push them or something, and they were like, well, maybe I can. Maybe I can do this.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then they decided not to. And then they had like this whole experience of really learning about themselves because they opted out and we rescheduled them for the next week, but they really had a lot to sit with. And the fact that we didn't push them actually like we passed some tests and
Mhm.
they went in and had a really amazing experience thanks to that felt sense of safety.
I mean, it speaks to the power of agency, right? You know, that when people feel like they have control over their own lives, they're willing to take more risks. Um, so I want to be respectful of your time, but it's kind of like the Super Bowl. We're tied up here, and we've got a little overtime. If you can hold off on dinner for a few minutes, there's a
Totally.
few more questions that I'd love to ask you here.
Cool.
So you're in Oregon, which is sort of, ground zero for interesting things happening in psychedelics. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on there and specifically sort of decriminalization versus legal medical use versus sort of this adult use model that you guys are piloting out there? Could you talk about sort of what you see, how you see that going and what you think the future might be around there?
Yeah. So I when people ask me that, I just usually talk about the very basics because there's so much changing day by day, and we're going through like significant growing pains. I'm just happy that it's here and it started, and we're having conversations about it, and that we're slowly figuring it out together.
Mhm.
It's not perfect at all by any means, and I think a lot of people right now think you can just show up in Oregon and just have a bunch of mushrooms, when in actuality, you need a service center. You need uh, a grower. You need people who are licensed in each one of those, and then you need to figure out who your facilitators are, because they can't be connected to the licensors or the service centers. And then you need another like entity to support the service center itself as another nonprofit. It gets really complicated really quickly, and it's one of the reasons why I have slowly like just stood back to be able to watch how this is all going to play out.
Mhm.
While in the meantime, like rightfully really grateful that we're having these psilocybin groups with heroic hearts, and that people one by one are finding places to experience entheogenic healing um,
Mhm.
in the US, and not having to like fly out into the world.
Mhm. Mhm.
The decrim model is one that I have a lot of respect for, especially for the protection of indigenous plant medicines. It's something that I try to practice even in my own life. Whereas if my culture, my heritage, where I come from, um, if I have not used this, I won't be practicing with it uh, or facilitating with it. And I think that's inherently what's in a lot of decrim models, is kind of the respect for keeping things safe. For legalization, I'm still figuring out what that looks like in so many different places. I
Mhm.
wish I had a better answer for you, but this is like my general take on it.
Oh, yeah. No, you guys are building the plane as you're flying it, right?
Yes.
Which is it makes it very interesting, potentially perilous, but also really super interesting.
Mhm.
We haven't talked much about nursing here because, obviously, you're a psychologist, but, I'm wondering, there's a question here in the audience about, do you think there are trainings or certifications that would be beneficial for nurses or non-nurses to do now in anticipation of this future work?
That's a really good question. Um, I think there's so much that nurses are exposed to that you actually have a deeper understanding than most psychologists or MDs to a person's lived experience, just from patient exposure and constantly being uh, in the room, in their lives, handling safety, advocacy, whatever it is, as well as medicine.
Mhm.
Um, the what I usually offer up is some kind of um, clinical certification when it comes to therapy. So there are so many talented RNs and nurse practitioners that just have an ability that I think most psychologists wish they had. Um, and so if there's a way to be Hakomi certified, if there's a way to find a practice in which feels most authentic for you. So the ability to touch is one that
Mhm.
I think most people are trained, at least psychologists are trained, not to do. And there's this whole other like ethical boundary that we have to attend to that nursing doesn't have to have. I think that's the natural progression. I think that most nurses can hold on to and actually have competitively in the field, that they can
Mhm.
do some somatic work, some really good somatic work with clients, and feel really natural around it.
Mhm.
So if there's ways to become more certified or more trained, really, to have more experience around that, I would suggest that.
Mhm. All right, Zach, last question here. Traditional ending question here. We always ask people, if you could go back to your younger self, I'm thinking conversation is kind of going full circle because we were talking about your initiation with 9/11 and the Marines and combat, but if you could go back to your younger self of whatever age you choose and give yourself a little advice knowing what you know now, what would you say?
Hmm. It's a good question. Um, I would say move slow. Uh,
Mm.
a lot of my friends know that I don't have a lot of patience because uh, I really am kind of stubborn and need things to happen now in my life. There's also the aspect of, I think you were there, Andrew. There's this great quote: "Urgency is a trap."
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whatever you feel that is so urgent in life, really look at that and wonder: is it right now, or is this something that's just coming up for you in a different way? So
Mm-hmm.
if I had anything to give myself, it would be slow down, wait for your moment, and then move in when invited, when called. A lot of the time,
Mm-hmm.
that's when my best experiences have happened, when I'm not looking for them or when I'm not waiting for go. It's just when I'm invited into certain circles at certain times that I didn't account for.
Yeah. Yeah. What a gift that is to in this sort of moment which feels very rushed and pressured and gotta get trained now, otherwise I'll miss the boat. That no, you can take some time here. It's okay to let this unfurl. Yeah. Hey Zach, how can people get in touch with you if they want to talk more with you?
They can shoot me an email. I'm at zach.skiles@heroicheartsproject.org. Or,
Okay.
yeah, I think that's what
Zach.Skiles
it
at
is.
heroicheartsproject.org.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And it's Zach with an H if you're listening and not don't see
That's the
the
correct
screen.
way to
Yeah.
spell Zach.
Yeah, and I know what that K is all about, right? All right, we've just put that in the chat. So, I mean, Zach, I don't remember when we met. Maybe it was 3 or 4 years ago, but I think you are the embodiment of that. You really walk your talk, and I think that's one of the things I really have always admired and respected about you, and that you give off an energy that feels very safe and inviting. And I hope that people watching this tonight and on the video and the replay um, get that same sense from you as well, because I can see how it must work very well for you with the folks that you work with these medicines, and how healing that must be. So, thank you for sharing a little bit of that magic with us tonight, and we look forward to talking with you again.
Thanks, brother. It's so good to spend time with you. I miss you a ton, and I can't wait to see you.
Yeah, no, it's hard to have you so far away. All right,
Mhm.
buddy. Till next time.
I'll see you.
Thanks everyone for watching.